Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is Funeral Service Insider from Kates-Boylston. Each episode features conversations about emerging trends and news that affect the death care industry. We talk to people who understand the delicate balance of change in a profession and vocation steeped in tradition. This week, I'm speaking with Niki Wiedeman. She's a training expert at Dead Ringers, a secret shopper and phone etiquette company. I wanted to have Niki on for a couple of reasons. The first is she's cool to talk to and she's super energetic, and that'll come out all by itself. But also, in the aftermath of the recent FTC kind of phone crackdown, a lot of people are worrying about what rules you have to say when you answer the phone, and that is something worth worrying about. But what Niki brings out in the show is you should be doing it because you're missing opportunities otherwise. Hitting the GPL buttons is secondary, getting people comfortable talking with people at your funeral home and getting people at your funeral home comfortable answering the phone like empathetic experts is the most critical point. And as long as this topic is top of mind for everyone, I thought it'd be really cool to talk about the opportunity here rather than the fear of the penalty. Although the fear of the penalty is real. This episode has a ton of head-slapping moments when you're like, oh yes, of course, why not? And I think you're going to get a kick out of it. So before we get started, let me remind you to please stick around for the post-mortem after the show. This week, I'm going to be talking about what could very well be a monster wave of acquisitions this year. We'll get into that. But for right now, here is Niki Wiedeman from Dead Ringers. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about the issue of answering the phone is because even though whether or not the FTC is stepping up its calling around, it's an invitation more than anything else to just make sure you're answering your phone correctly. And I wanted to start off by getting you to talk a little bit about what are some of the things you see at Dead Ringers that it's like if you had to do like a top 5 things that are going to go wrong when people are answering the phone when they first start, when you first start shopping them, like what would those 5 things be, for example, or 4 things or top 2, whichever.
That's interesting. As a part of our training, we have a top 5 list of the things that we're hearing that are a theme. And most surprisingly to us at Dead Ringers is the lack of empathy. And when we first started this, we felt that a lot of the work that we would be doing would be technical. And we'll get into that too about pricing maybe in a future question. But the lack of empathy is astounding to us. Next would be missed opportunities. You mentioned, an invitation or a door being open. We just don't listen enough. We feel that we need to be it's almost clinical sounding. So when we have a discussion with families, we don't open up the opportunity to have a follow-up with them later on. So that's a really key piece, is that we don't have the opportunity to create a relationship there. We provide confusing information. That's one of the next things that we find. Well, I'll just say that we use our own terminology, which can mean nothing to a consumer sometimes.
Right.
The word at need, that's our word. The word pre-need, that's our word. We tend to use acronyms, GPL, for instance, DC for death certificate. So, that's another key piece that we see happening within kind of our top 5 list as well. There's a lack of listening, I think. So we do most of the talking. That's another key issue that we hear when we're listening to some of the calls. And then probably more of if I were a consumer, I get on the phone with someone who answers it. I tell my story. My dad's in hospice. My grandmother has passed away. And I'm transferred to someone, say it's a licensed funeral director, and I have to tell the story all over again. So these are the little things I think that if we just tweak them and we're cognizant of them, that could make a really big difference. And we measure everything. So we have stats on the things that I just talked about, and overall call quality. We talk about pricing and we put metrics to that as well. And I mentioned the missed opportunities piece there. Of all of the calls that we've placed, and I want to say we're at 10,000 that we called in and recorded and helped funeral homes listen to those and train to those. Follow-up is our lowest score. Only 7% of the time are we providing an open door to get back in touch with the family. A lot of times we're thankful as we end a call and close a call, but we don't set the expectation. And what we do is we are there for folks, whether they make arrangements with us or not, whether a death occurred or not, that we're not leaving the door open.
I want to start right from the beginning of that list, because the empathy piece is the thing that actually makes the most sense to me as someone who gets you get a lot of spam calls, you get a lot of shopping calls, and just, how to get up for every call, even though 90% of the time it's either a shopper or a spam.
Yeah.
And it's hard because a lot of times, even, I'll call a person, I'll get a phone call and I'll answer it like hesitantly, like, hello. And they're like, hi, Tony. I'm like, yeah, what do you want? Like, get to the point, because I think you're calling me to scam me, and that can be difficult. I think is that something you find people have trouble getting up for every call?
I think it takes strong mental fortitude in this profession, obviously. And this day and age, we have so much technology that these robocalls, as you would call them, they can really cut into trying to do a good job. And the phone really is the lifeline for our profession still.
Right.
I think there are some offerings, like whether it would be kind of a cremation society, something like that, where it's much more transactional and online. But the phone really still is a key part of that. One way we can think about this is you never know who's going to be on the other end of the phone. And even if it looks like a spam number, you can't take that chance.
Right.
And that number might be the FTC as well. So we give some techniques and things. They're kind of, what do you call it? Woo woo. Take a deep breath, and get in the shoes of that other person. And that's what empathy is expressing that not necessarily you know what they're going through. And I think sometimes we get caught up in that if we're serving 400 or 500 families a year, that it's the same over and over for every human being, when it's not. So I think that's something that we ask folks just to take a step back and really, why did you get into this profession? Our metrics, I think, as of today, 26% of the time, based on our scoring, we're not showing empathy. And that can be simply just the tone of voice. We're not asking for names. That's another key piece, is that it's really surprising is when we call in that we aren't getting people's names, especially those pricing callers, those shoppers. That can open up, I think, a much better conversation by asking for their name. Now, they don't want to give it to you. You just move along with the call. But those little touches can be very helpful. We often hear funeral homes express their condolences, but it's very flat. It doesn't sound sincere. So listening to your recorded voice is something as a part of our training. We hate to hear that. When this podcast airs, I'm going to hate to hear the way that my voice sounds. But, just really understanding what you sound like. I've had a lot of people say, oh, I had no idea that's what I sounded like. So it really can be ear opening, I guess you could say, or eye opening. Yeah, when you just take a listen to what you sound like.
So I have to edit this every week, and I've been doing a podcast in one form for the last really almost 20 years now. And it keeps, so did you hear that space? That space, I would have said a lot of the time, but when you have to cut 1,000 out of a half an hour of talking, it does help shape the way you speak when you listen to yourself over and over again. And you're like, I lean on that phrase a lot. I say a lot.
Yeah.
Things like that, hearing it back, that makes perfect sense, that it would help you to kind of hone in on what you would like. How would you like to sound better? How would you like to present yourself to a stranger better? That makes absolute and utter sense.
Yeah. And no.
I almost didn't say it, but I didn't want to make everybody self-conscious about it. I promise I'll say a lot, just not nearly as much as I used to.
And we have very delicate things that we're talking about in these calls. If we're hemming and hawing and umming, it sounds like we don't know what we're doing or we're not prepared. So knowing your offerings, being able to articulate the value that you bring to people is so much better when we sound prepared and get away from stumbling over our words. You need to practice. And I think sometimes doesn't sound feasible. I don't know, but just simply practicing your offering, knowing what your prices are. there's so many times we'll place calls and we'll hear paper rumble. There are times, well, I need to get into my office to do this. And we challenge our funeral homes, also our cemeteries as well, is that you need to know your product inside and out because it will really set you above and beyond your competitors. And it's getting more and more competitive every day. Consumers are changing. They want experiences over what we call customer service, which tends to be much more transactional, and building experiences with people, especially with price shoppers. Even though you may be more expensive, say, than a competitor, if you take that extra step, you show empathy, you don't miss those opportunities, then you may have an opportunity to serve that family just simply based on good phone skills, I guess, during that particular call.
Because if you're going to charge more, then everything should be better. If you're answering and it's got to start with answering the phone. Yeah, I do charge more, and look how much more pleasant it was to be on the phone with me than the guy. You could save $100 and call someone who's going to have to go ask their boss whether we do funerals or not, or you can go with someone who's clearly knows what they're talking about right off the bat.
Yeah. And we find in more competitive markets, this is really important. There are a lot of those smaller firms and smaller markets where they've locked up the population, I guess,
Right.
within their market area. And so I think firms that have more of a risk in losing families to a competitor really see the value in upping their phone skills. On the reverse of that, though, there are people who think they do a really good job and they haven't called themselves, if you know what I mean. So we will secret shop folks that aren't actually working with us. And like sometimes we get a little pompous in that we do the best that we can. But if we're not listening as owners or managers, I think they become really surprised in the performance and the level their staff might be serving the families that call in. And I don't mean to sound mean or tough, but we don't have time.
Well,
the time is crucial. And then this also leads into people looking outside of the profession to handle these things, whether it's, using an event planner. I think we've talked about that for years within the profession, is that we're seeing people take the reins on this and running with it themselves. The funeral home maybe is just there to embalm or cremate, and then the party afterwards is done by someone outside of the profession. So we need to step up our game because our competitors aren't necessarily the other funeral home down the street.
Yeah, I've actually done multiple profiles over the last couple of years of people who just got into the event business to do funerals. A guy who had a funeral home, he hired a woman to do the outreach, and she doesn't even go to the funeral home. She has a separate office in town, and she just connects with restaurants and makes these planning things, and she answers those calls, right? And that's a higher level employee making the effort. Like I'm here because I need to do an excellent job, and getting people to feel that way. Again, 8 hours at a time, 6 days in a row, it can be difficult. I wanted to ask you also about the listening, because you brought up one really kind of sticky point where I'm here to answer the phone, but I don't know anything else. So like, at what point do you say, okay, stop talking because I don't want you to have to repeat this story again? Or is it better to just relay the story to the funeral director? Like, how is it best handled that way, I guess?
Good questions create good conversations. That's a part of our training. And if someone calls in and says, how much does it cost to do cremation there? And we say, well, our direct cremation is $19.95. That happens a lot. We lead with our lowest cost option first, but we don't engage in just questions to get the person talking. That creates, again, kind of a clinical look at, as you place that call.
Mm-hmm.
But, a simple question is, oh, I'm so sorry. Has a loss occurred? Just those kinds of things, instead of just running into the pricing and all of that. Is it okay if I ask your name? Who's calling? Those kinds of things get started in a conversation, asking questions of folks. There's one firm we work with that we like to steal good things. And, their question is, have you had to make arrangements before? And that gives the funeral director leverage. If they have, they're like, oh, well, I'm here to help you. This is why I'm here, is to educate you and to make this a process that will create a meaningful service for the family, whatever that might be. So you get to asking questions, and then you get away from kind of that clinical stuff. Now, if someone asks for price, the FTC requirement says that we need to give a price. And I don't know that we want to spend a lot of time on that here today. Right. There are a lot of other resources and things out there when it comes to the technical part of what we do. But that's the science part, I think, the technical piece. But then what we're missing is the art, showing empathy, truly listening. And we've had several calls where people, they don't listen to what the person's asked for. So they'll go through this diatribe when it's a preemie call, when they think, things like that. It just really shows that you're not listening if you address it. We have a lot of firms that are combo firms, that there's a funeral home and cemetery on site. And so we've had calls where we'll call in and say, can you tell me about cremation? And they don't ask enough questions and we end up at the cemetery when that's not where we wanted to go. So good questions create a good outcome. And it really can be embarrassing. You go through all of the spiel and then you're with the wrong person and they're like, oh no, you really need to be talking to the funeral home or vice versa. Clarifying questions are really important.
And again, this is why I think this is useful is because as long as everyone's going to panic and look at their phone, rather than just drill in on, okay, what do we have to say? Like, what do we get to say? How do we get to make this a place where on the off chance that it's a person actually looking for a funeral, we absolutely nail that call. The thing that always I like to talk about is the follow-up, because it drives me bonkers as someone from the outside. All I do is write all day about, pre-need this, pre-need that, pre-need the other thing. How do we get leads? Well, you can answer the phone. That's a way to get a lead, right?
I think also setting the expectation that there are next steps. We have firms that say, do you have arrangements on file with us? That's another beautiful question, because if they don't, that gets them thinking, oh, I could have arrangements on file. So those leading, whether it's an aftercare program that you're running, if you set the seed at the beginning of the process, then it's much less tough to try to get into the family's home and help them afterwards. So I think setting the tone is really important. We have a saying that we say that, you're going through a call with the family and you've talked prices or whatever that might be. And especially with the price shopper is you set the expectation. The next natural step is for us to meet, or for you to come into the funeral home, or for you to come into the cemetery and see our beautiful grounds. Now they may say, no, I don't have time for that, but you're creating the expectation versus hoping they'll call.
Right. Or that it'll occur to them to come in and say, well, yeah, maybe I will just go in and make an appointment.
Yeah. Now I know we have those tough families that call in and, life is not perfect. We know that. And you'll have some of those rough calls, but I like for our profession to know that more in your little pinky finger than a family will ever know, and be proud of the knowledge and that you can take care of a family very well and don't get tripped up by those things. And you set the stage. You're the educator. By making that kind of impression, you're more likely to get a referral, say. If I'm talking with I had a really good experience with Wiedeman Funeral Home, and then that way you're more likely to get referral families as a part of that.
And you had mentioned, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but do you happen to have the stats on the follow-up, how places tend to rate on follow-up?
It's our lowest score. We have a scale of 0 to 100, and we feel a good bench line of all of these of all of these scores is about a 70. And the lowest score is follow-up information and setting the tone for follow-up. And only 25% of the time do we offer a follow-up opportunity for our families. We do a good job in closing the call, and it's saying goodbye, but without leaving the door open and keeping the phone lines open. So it's our lowest score in all that we do. We ask a simple question of our dead ringers, as we call them, as they place calls into funeral homes. And at the end, it's like, did they offer any follow-up? It's just a simple yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's even offering an email. We've covered a lot today. Is it okay that I email you our price list, or email you some more information that you may find helpful? Just little simple things like that. I think another really good technique is sending folks to your website. They may have probably already Googled you prior to that call, but sending them to the website. I work with firms that do a beautiful job at saying, now there's a tab that says what you need to know, or whatever that might be. So then when you go to the website, they know exactly where to go based on where they are in the process.
And that is the positive version of the negative, because didn't you play a tape where people were like, you just find it on our website?
Yes. one, that's an FTC violation and just directing someone to the website without answering the question about pricing. But yeah, it's the positive spin on that is that once you do your job, once you're compliant, once you've made a connection with the family, is that they're still, that you're giving them something to do after the call. A lot of times people are, whether they're going through grief, it's just, is there something that can help me through this? So I think that's a key piece of this. And we do another thing with follow up. And if we are on a call where pricing information is provided, we capture that dollar amount. If a family or if the funeral home doesn't provide follow up, we track that. So there's a dollar amount tied to it. We call it a lost call or a one call. And a lost call is I haven't provided any follow up. In our mind, you're not leaving the door open to serve that family later. As of, over the last 6 months, I have some measurements here. And all of the calls that we've placed, we have lost $3.4 million in potential in serving our families and all of the customers that we work with. Now, from a one perspective, we're, less than half of that, but that's a huge number.
Yeah.
So, opportunities just within our own client base that you're able to actually tie a dollar amount to it. Now, it's not exact science, but it gives really an idea of if I'm not opening the door and setting the stage for a next step, that there's the opportunity they're going to go down the street. So we really want to it's a gut punch, I guess you could say, to just really show if you're doing this, you're leaving money on the table, and you're also losing the opportunity to connect and serve a family.
Hey, I want to take a second to talk to you about some of the upcoming events we have at Kates-Boylston. First off, we have a bunch of webinars coming up. What's cool about the webinars is if you miss them, you can always leave your email address and we'll let you know where you can find them online. That way you can watch them at your leisure. Although if you attend, you do get to ask questions live, which is a nice bonus. Coming up in March, we have Funeral Compliance and Online Sales, What You Need to Know. And this will be presented by Luke Freeberg, Mitch Smith, and Tracy Whitaker from eFuneral Solutions. They plan to bring everybody up to speed on this new focus on funeral rule violations by the FTC, plus the future of funeral pricing, disclosure agreements, and how digital tools can enhance FTC compliance strategies. In addition to webinars, we hold virtual conferences throughout the year, and actually we'll have a live one coming up that I'll talk about soon. But today what I'd like to talk about, though, is our upcoming 3-hour virtual event sponsored by Memories Share. We call it Revenue Generation, and its aim is to help you find ways that you may have already missed that can help generate a little revenue for your business. Our expert presenters will, in addition to talking about different strategies that you can use to generate revenue, provide insights and explanations about where the funeral industry may be going and how you can prepare yourself for the new future. As always, and as with everything, you can find all this information at Kates-Boylston.com. That is KATES-BOYLSTON.com. Or you can check out the show notes where there will be links to everything. Kates-Boylston has been guiding funeral service professionals for nearly 150 years. Stay informed, stay ahead. One of the things I've been, like I said, I write about pre-need until my eyes go cross. A successful pre-need salesperson, one of the larger companies told me this, will close 35% of the time. That's 65% no's all the time. But since 100% of people die, just making sure you're hitting those again and again and again, as long as it's a positive experience, when that person dies, if you're the last funeral home they called, you might get that business. And that's not something anybody can track, but it's something everybody can prepare for.
And I think sometimes our businesses, I spent 26 years with a pre-need company. So is near and dear to me. And a lot of times I've heard it called the necessary evil. At need is where we live, which that's absolutely fine. But, you mentioned the gal doesn't have her office in the funeral home. Good for them. She shouldn't be in the funeral home. She should be out, working within the community. So I think with pre-need, outbound calls tend to be much more important sometimes than inbound calls. but it really works both ways. I think we sometimes lose business because we take let's say I'm a frontline facilitator. That's why I call the folks that answer the phone on those busy firms.
Mm-hmm.
If we're not urgent about that, it becomes stale, right? And the funeral home may miss out on that particular pre-need because I'm looking for help with this, and they move on to the next firm, that they've Googled or whatever that might be. That is a corporate strategy, if you were to think of it in that way, is that pre-need is not a necessary evil. Pre-need can help you to have longevity within your market.
Earlier on, you talked about how you figured out pricing. Is that what you mentioned before we get started? Can you talk about that for a little bit before we run all the way out of time?
Our dead ringers, as I mentioned, will call into a funeral home or cemetery and ask how much does it cost for a funeral service there? How much does it cost to do a cremation? And of course, the good firms will provide the correct pricing information, and our dead ringers will then note that in our system, in our process. If in that call I'm not offered a follow-up, which would be, I can call you back if you have any additional questions. That's a simple entree into a follow-up. I'd mentioned the next natural step is, again, I'm here for you. We'd like for you to come in and see the facility. If I do a call and I answer their questions and I say goodbye, not offering up a next step, that's where we miss those opportunities. And I mentioned only 25% of the time are we providing an opportunity for follow-up. That being said, the amount that we track on every single call where pricing is a question, as of the last 6 months only, based on all of the firms that we've placed calls for, it's $3.4 million that have been left on the table because we didn't offer the opportunity to follow up.
When I watched the webinar, and is the webinar still up, right? I can link to that in the show notes?
Yes.
When I watched the webinar, you asked one of the questions that I love to hear asked, which is, when was the last time you called your funeral home?
Mm-hmm.
What can you give me some thumbnail? What should I do if I want to call my funeral home myself and see where I stand? What are some of the best questions to ask?
Most consumers aren't going to be really versed in what we do. Now, you may have those folks that have maybe gone through this several times and they may feel that, but we've suggested that have your best friend call or someone that's not you and just say, how would you approach this? We put the human element in it. We don't want to over-engineer a question that you might ask. And so my dad's in hospice. What do I do? Just
Right.
some simple, I'm trying to make arrangements for my grandmother. She passed away. What are my next steps? How much does it cost to do a cremation there? Just very simple questions like that. And then you can hear how folks respond in that way. Some of my clients in my past pre-need life have actually done that live within a conference meeting where they're a group of managers is together and they actually call the funeral home, have them on speakerphone to see how they do. And I think folks are shocked in that we just don't train our people to be on the phone. And I think that's kind of where we've helped a missing link there, I guess you could say. But just being my best friend, how would you call and what would you say? And leaving it up to the consumer. I think sometimes if we over-engineer it, we give away our identity.
Right.
This is a offer, based on the types of questions that they ask. And you can always, talk to us about those kinds of questions too. Little plug there.
It's hard to find a balance because when you do those, conference calls, the poor kid on the end of the line is going to get clobbered, and I think it's important to make this a positive learning experience rather than you never know when I'm going to call you and try to trap you kind of experience, right?
Yeah. And that's something we've struggled with a little bit, in that they feel that there's Big Brother, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do. Is that this is about our families, and this is about how we represent ourselves into the community when folks call in, or the outbound calls that we make as well. So that's I think a really key piece. I spent, 10 years on a college for mortuary science, and there's no curriculum on the phone. There's no curriculum in a mortuary school. Now I've heard them kind of talk about it. As apprentices, I think sometimes we've asked funeral homes, who's on the phone? Well, we usually put the apprentice on the phone. It's like this lowly job when I think it should really be elevated. You mentioned the gal that has her own office. It's, again, making this much more of a professional and respected part of what the business does. And you're really giving credence where credence is due to those folks who aren't licensed, that are answering a phone that rings all day long, and, helping them to see that they're a true value to the company as well. That is a key part of the business. And I think being self-aware of that is really important. There are times when we have called into funeral homes and we can hear, it's almost as if they're hanging around the office manager's, the front line facilitator's desk, and you can hear that background noise. So, those kinds of things, those matter. And people, the background, you mentioned me, sounds like I'm hitting my mic. Those little things can make a big difference.
You don't want to hear laughter in the background.
No. Yeah, we call them cringeworthy calls. We've got some doozies.
Well, we're coming up against it now. So
Okay.
Before I let you go, I'm going to ask you my favorite final question, which is there anything I should have asked and didn't? Or is there anything you thought you'd get the opportunity to say, but I didn't provide it?
One thing that just kind of popped into my head was when you put someone on hold. Research has shown us the number one reason consumers want to call into any business is being put on hold. Now, we don't find that funeral homes are as painful as calling, say, AT&T or something like that. But being put on hold, and I've just lost my dad, and there is silence, or there's music, and it sounds like music from the 80s in the elevator, or there's a recorded message. We feel that a recorded message is probably the best way to handle that. So those are some of the kind of marketing kind of things that we talk about. Avoiding, with that hold, a cold transfer into someone. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Being aware of hold times is really important.
The cold thing, we talked about that because you mentioned, I told you my whole story, and then you just transferred me to somebody blind, and they're like, hello, why am I on the phone with you? Making sure that transition happens kind of elegantly is a critical part, I'd expect.
The highest score that we see is that very initial answer. So when I call into a funeral home, we find that the clients that we work with are articulate, that you can understand the name of the firm. They offer up their own name and maybe some kind of buffer statement. How can I help you today? So we have a score of 85 on that particular one. So our profession does a really good job in answering the phone. It's the magic that needs to happen after that initial answer is what we need to tackle.
Right, because you said your other highest score was the hanging up. So they're good at picking up and putting down.
Hanging up.
Middle part could use a little bit of work.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Make sure you check out the show notes, because that's where you can get in touch with us and leave feedback if you'd like. You can find all the links mentioned in this week's episode, including where to get to the FTC phone answering webinar, and of course, all of the webinars and upcoming events that I mentioned in the commercial in the middle. I always like to say subscribe, and you seem to be subscribing, so I'm going to keep saying it. Thank you for subscribing, for everyone who continues to subscribe. And if you've not subscribed or followed, it's called following now on Apple. Please follow the show. Just click the little plus button at the top. We're available on Spotify. We're available on Apple. We're available on Amazon. If you're listening to this on a podcatcher, we're on that podcatcher. Just click follow or subscribe or download. For this week's postmortem, I wanted to talk about really covering the SCI earnings call earlier this month. And this month is February, if you're listening in the future, February 2024. One of the kind of throwaway lines among the financial types, but something that I think is pretty interesting for the funeral service types, is SCI is coming to the end of an agreement to not pursue funeral homes in about 59 different markets across the country. And now they were clear when they did their talking, and I believe them because it makes sense. It's not like when this agreement ends in May, they're going to, add 1,000 funeral homes or anything like that. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of M&A action over the next couple of months in 2024. If when the Fed, reduces interest rates, if money starts to get cheap, as money starts to get cheaper, I think we're going to see a lot more of consolidators moving in where they're able to, and not just SCI. Park Lawn, I just finished, as I'm recording this on February 21st, I just finished, typing up a press release about another major acquisition by Park Lawn. And there are smaller consolidators and smaller companies that are going to take advantage of lower interest rates if they become available. Now, I've got to just say that this is a fact of life and will always be one for the small and independent funeral home owners. But if you don't have a succession plan, it's probably time to start to take a look at one. I see all of these. We have a lot of experts speak at Kates-Boylston, and a lot of the companies that, help make succession plans, and even a lot of the small consolidators, give me the impression that it's something that should be on your mind pretty early if you're a funeral home owner. And if you're a funeral home manager or someone who hopes to own a funeral home someday, it's still a world where you want to be involved, because the more you know about how the transition takes place and the longer you study it, the better off you're going to be at the end of your career, or as your career comes to an end, or as you decide to move away from your career. But anyway, that is something to think about. All of the stories are available on FSI. I do want to say that we have an in case you missed it section of FSI that is free. It's on Kates-Boylston.com, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Every day I post new news from all around the country about just different funeral homes. These are small transactions in small towns, accolades that funeral directors get. And if a funeral director gets a little news coverage, I like to share it with the rest of the community. If you get news coverage and you want me to share it, please, again, just reach out. My email is arusso@kbpublications.com, but all of that is available in the show notes. And until next time, this has been Funeral Service Insider, the podcast.